This is the 1150T Unit 11 Cold War Test Review, and I'm just going to do like always, go through these questions, discuss them, give my opinions about them, and then you can use that to hopefully do well on the test yourself. And you can also use some of this information to fill out your own review. So let's just go through these questions one by one. So question number one was, what was the immediate impact of the end of World War II? And there were a couple of things. First of all, the U.S. and the USSR emerged as superpowers, and the Cold War began. So how did the Cold War differ from World War II? The Cold War was an ideological conflict. Capitalism versus communism, free market economy versus command economy, democracy versus authoritarian one-party rule. And it was not a war in which both superpowers went directly at each other militarily, but rather it was a contest in which the superpowers backed various conflicting smaller powers in proxy wars, like, for example, Vietnam or Korea, or many, many others during that entire long 40-plus year period. And so by the end of World War II, the American attitude toward the Soviet Union had turned from wartime friendship to a desire to what? And this was the desire to stop the spread of communism worldwide. We Americans had a strong, and still have a strong, visceral fear of communism, and we felt very threatened by the Soviet Union. So what was the first thing that the Soviets did in parts of Eastern Europe that they had occupied after World War II? And they turned these Eastern European countries into Soviet satellite states with one-party communist governments. And so what pledge did Stalin make to Truman and Churchill, but then failed to keep? He pledged at the Yalta Conference in March 1945 to allow these countries of Eastern Europe that they had rolled into in their war against the Nazis to have free elections. And he broke that promise almost right away. And so which United States policy, we're going through this fast, which United States policy was aimed primarily at the containment of communism, and that was called the Truman Doctrine. Truman Doctrine and containment are pretty much two terms that go hand in hand together. And so the names of the seven, and it's really kind of, I don't know, I'm going to say, really, if you want to split hairs, I'm going to change this to eight Soviet satellite states of Eastern Europe. And they are Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, which actually left in 1960, and Yugoslavia, which left in 1948. And so how did these, just moving this up, how did the Soviet and Chinese communisms differ from each other? You know, you had Soviet-style communism, and then in 1949, when China was taken over by Mao Zedong and went communist in 1949, they had a different style of communism based on the different conditions that were going on in China. The USSR emphasized the role of the industrial urban factory worker. And that was the proletariat as Karl Marx saw it back in the 19th century. But China, a far more agrarian, agricultural country, they emphasized that the worker was the peasant farmer. So Marxist-Leninist theory was actually applied to peasant farmers out in the country doing communal farm work. And so what are the main events that occurred during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union? You could list for days the events that occurred during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and you can list even more if you want to throw China into the mix. But just to cover the highlights, consider these: the fall of the Iron Curtain over all of Eastern Europe, the announcement of the Truman Doctrine and its containment policy, The Marshall Plan, keep in mind what that is, the Berlin Airlift, the division of Germany into East and West, the development of the atomic weapons by the USSR, the formation of NATO, the formation of the Warsaw Pact, the Red Scare, the arms race, Sputnik, the space race, the building of the Berlin Wall, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so all of these are the big highlights of the Cold War, specifically between the United States and the Soviet Union. So what was the main objective of the United States and its allies during the Korean War? So we're moving over to Asia. And the idea behind the Korean War was to stop the spread of communism coming out of China, which had recently gone communist. And so that was a big deal because we subscribe to the Domino Theory, which we'll be talking about in a second. So the Korean War and the Vietnam War and the nuclear arms race were all important events in what era of world history? Goes without saying, the Cold War, of course. That was an easy one. So how are these conflicts in Korea and Vietnam similar? Okay, so they were both in Asia. They were both North against South, where the North was communist, the South was democratic. And the pursuit of both of these wars was dominated by the Domino Theory, which was a theory that was very unproven, and yet everybody subscribed to it, which theorized that if one Asian country were to fall to communism, its neighbors would also fall. And we found out over the course of time, one of the things that we learned at the end of the Cold War was that the Domino Theory didn't hold water. And we're going to find out why in a second. So how were the Korean and Vietnam Wars different? The Korean War ended with an armistice in which both the communist North Korea and the democratic South Korea stayed separate. Both separate countries still exist to this very day. The South Korea is a close U.S. ally with a free market economy and a huge film and television industry, as you may know if you've been watching Netflix any, and K-pop and all that stuff. North Korea, on the other hand, is a communist hermit country which is extremely hostile to the U.S. and its allies. Its closest friend is China, and that's really no help to us at all because China actually likes the fact that North Korea makes all kinds of trouble for everyone else that China would love to make if it could. Vietnam is a very different story from Korea. After fighting there for 8 years and losing, the U.S. pulled out of that fight between the communist North Vietnam and the supposedly freedom-loving Western democracy South Vietnam. And with us out of the way, North Vietnam invaded the South and conquered it easily. And so today, there's only one Vietnam, and it's a communist country. But we have a much, much better relationship with Vietnam than we can ever hope to have with North Korea. And it's become a tradition that presidents of the United States visit Vietnam at least once during their term in office. And it's always very friendly. It's a very big deal. And you can go to Vietnam today and visit and be perfectly safe. And you certainly can't do that with North Korea, that's for sure. So how did young Chinese citizens show support for communist government policies during the Cultural Revolution? Cultural Revolution lasted from about 1966 to about 1976. These 11 million high school and college-age people showed their loyalty to communist leader Mao Zedong and his little red book, which he had written and he espoused. They traveled the country, and as they traveled the country, they attacked intellectuals such as doctors and professors and managers and scientists and writers and artists. And this was a group that they joined called the Red Guards. And the Red Guards would often send these people, these academics and these intellectuals, to go out and work in the fields. And so that went on for a number of years, and it was a complete disaster, just like the Great Leap Forward was. So, which factor, or maybe factors, I think it's just factor, increased Western fears of the Soviet Union in the 1950s? Hint, boom. That hint makes it easy. Basically, the big factor was that the Soviet Union developed atomic weapons. So we had a monopoly on atomic weapons between 1945, when we used 2 of them against Japan and ended World War II, and 1949. And then in 1949, the Soviets managed to have a successful test of their own atomic weapons, and that began the arms race. Cuban Missile Crisis. We've got a picture right there of Nikita Khrushchev and Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, in an arm wrestling match, and they're sitting on top of missiles. And that is a symbol, if you will, of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that happened in about 1962. And basically, the island of Cuba in the Caribbean and the USSR were close allies. And Cuba allowed the USSR to install Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuban territory on the island, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And these missiles would have been able to strike deep into the United States from very close range. And our president, John F. Kennedy, made it very clear to the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, that missiles in Cuba were simply not going to be tolerated. And so he had the Navy set up a naval blockade of ships coming from the Soviet Union to Cuba, but he didn't call it a blockade because blockade sounds kind of warlike. And so the United States called it a quarantine. That's a word we're familiar with. Khrushchev gave in. He backed down, and he announced that the missiles would be removed from Cuba and there wouldn't be any nuclear missiles in Cuba. In exchange for that, however, Khrushchev got a couple of things as well, and that's something we don't often think about. We think that Khrushchev was the big loser, and it killed his reputation, ended his career, and all that. But he got the United States to promise never again to try to overthrow the Cuban government. We had tried to overthrow the Cuban government. It failed, and we promised the Soviets that we wouldn't ever try again. And Khrushchev also got the United States to remove its missiles from Turkey, which is also very close to the Soviet Union. So it was a pretty fair exchange. You've got a list of some communist leaders and some countries, and the question is, which communist leader during the Cold War is correctly matched with his country? So, we've got Fidel Castro, Soviet Union. No, they don't match. Fidel Castro was the leader of Cuba. Nikita Khrushchev was not the leader of Cuba. He was the leader of the Soviet Union. Mao Zedong was not the leader of Korea. He was the leader of China. So the only correct answer is Ho Chi Minh, the leader of Vietnam. We fought him for many years. He had become a dedicated communist way back when he was living in France, actually. And interesting tidbit, when he died, on his desk, the book that he was reading at the time of his death was actually the biography of John Brown, the abolitionist who tried to raid the federal armory at Harper's Ferry and was hanged for it, if you remember that story from American history. That was the biography that Ho Chi Minh was actually reading. So that was interesting. So what was the primary goal of the Viet Cong in the 1960s? And remember, the Viet Cong was indeed Ho Chi Minh's army, and their goal was to unite North and South Vietnam under one communist government. Not to have two Vietnams, they wanted one Vietnam, and they wanted it to be a one-party communist Vietnam. So moving back over to Eastern Europe, we're looking at Lech Walesa and Mikhail Gorbachev. How are they similar? And they both lived in Eastern Europe. Of course, Lech Walesa was Polish, Mikhail Gorbachev was Russian. But one thing you can say about them that they had in common was that they were both serious reformists. And otherwise, their backgrounds were quite different. And we're going to learn a little bit more about Lech Walesa in just a second. What were the three main measures taken by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev? Like I said, Mikhail Gorbachev came into the Soviet Union as a younger leader, replacing a lot of older leaders, and he had some reform measurements in mind, including glasnost. And glasnost means openness. Openness in terms of the media, in terms of the press, in terms of free speech and individual rights. Another reform measure that Mikhail Gorbachev had was called perestroika. And perestroika was a restructuring of that command economy that the Soviet Union had and allowing some small-scale petty capitalism. And then finally, nuclear arms reduction. And here's a fourth one for you. Getting the Soviet Union out of its long war with Afghanistan. They had been at war in Afghanistan for a number of years, and he got that war ended. Pope John Paul II, what influence did he have upon the end of the Cold War? Keep in mind that Pope John Paul, was actually Polish himself. Poland is a very, very Catholic country. John Paul II visited Poland and told his people there to continue to resist communism, telling them not to be afraid. Do not be afraid was his big quote. So whose policies ultimately made the fall of the Berlin Wall possible? And that was Mikhail Gorbachev with his policies of not only glasnost, not only perestroika, but also the basic policy of refusing to use violence to suppress people like Walesa and his labor union Solidarity. And so why was there so much political unrest in Eastern Europe in the 1980s? And one of the things we said was the command economy. And we're going to talk about that more in a second. But a command economy cannot withstand the competition with a free market economy. Eastern Europe was right next to all of these wealthy, prosperous Western Europe countries. They could see the stark difference between what was going on in the economy over there and the economy they had on their side, and it was causing a lot of frustration and resentment. So that's one of the things you want to keep in mind as far as why there was so much political unrest in Eastern Europe in the 1980s. Now, going way back, Karl Marx, and we've touched on him, we've made numerous passes at him, very important figure in world history and one of the most important figures in the 19th century. What did Karl Marx predict would happen to free market economies around the world, and did it actually happen? So back in the 1800s, Karl Marx predicted that because free market economies were so increasingly exploitative toward the working class, because they supposedly steal from the working class, that the workers would eventually overthrow these capitalist factory owners, this class of bourgeoisie is what he called them, in a violent revolution. And then, after that violent revolution, the workers would control all the means of production, and society would be a classless workers' paradise, where there was no more want, no more need. There was no more need for property. You wouldn't need any property. You wouldn't miss not having property because there'd be so much abundance, because there wouldn't be this wealthy capitalist class stealing everything. And so that was Karl Marx. Did that actually happen? I would say no. So what was the problem with the Soviet Union's command economy? In a command economy, there's really no incentive to work hard because hard work is not rewarded. And so command economies cannot compete with free market economies where people are working hard because they know or they have a reasonable expectation that their hard work will be rewarded. So which leader organized the first free trade union in Eastern Europe since the beginning of the Cold War and eventually became the leader of his country? And that would be Lech Walesa, the electrician. He's an electrician at a dockyard in Gdansk, Poland. And he turns into a union leader and then a founding member of the union Solidarity. And, he eventually became the president of Poland. But he organized the first free trade union in Eastern Europe. Keep in mind that, theoretically, a workers' union shouldn't have to exist in a communist country. Because, like Karl Marx said, in a communist country, the workers have overthrown the capitalist bourgeoisie. There is no more capitalism. There are no more bourgeoisie to exploit the workers. The workers have won. The government emphasizes the importance of the worker. So why would a communist country need a labor union? Makes no sense. And so Lech Walesa actually got the first free trade labor union in Eastern Europe organized since the beginning of the Cold War. And that was a huge blow to communism because communism is supposed to be in support of workers. A labor union shouldn't be necessary to protect workers and represent workers. So I'm going a little farther than I wanted to with that one. So what did President Ronald Reagan demand that Gorbachev do when he came to Berlin in 1987, actually, 1987, I think it's 1987, and made a speech. And his big quote was, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Interesting because it sounds very confrontational when you say it like that. But Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev actually became quite good friends. They had a great relationship with each other and actually a level of trust with each other that made the Cold War able to come to an end, actually. What was an important effect? We're going over to India now. We're going over to decolonization. What was an important effect of the independence of the Indian subcontinent after British rule? And this is kind of a tragic one. That was the partition of India into two countries, India and Pakistan. India was a country of two religions, Hinduism and Islam. And when the reason that they partitioned India into two countries, India and Pakistan, was so that there could be a Hindu country, India, and an Islamic country, Pakistan. Problem was, when you partitioned the India into two countries like this, didn't matter where you tried to draw that border, you were going to have millions of Hindus on the wrong side and millions of Muslims on the wrong side. And so that partition caused the uprooting of countless people who had to cross each other in order to get where their new homeland is supposed to be. And that crossing of each other led to all kinds of violence that killed like 500,000 people. So it was a very tragic situation. And so what factors best explain independence of former European colonies in Africa and Asia after World War II? And there are three main factors. First, you've got this European-style education of future resistance leaders. Of course, they don't know they're going to be resistance leaders until like long after they've been educated. But future resistance leaders such as Gandhi in India and Sukarno in Indonesia, including, with that education, including the teaching of liberal Enlightenment values such as democracy and freedom and individual rights. And you're teaching these things to people who you're trying to oppress and exploit. Not a good idea. You also had another factor, was two world wars, especially World War II, in which European powers lost not only the material means after that war to maintain these far-flung colonies, but also the moral authority to lord power over these colonies. I mean, Europeans had allowed massive death and destruction, as well as a huge genocide to happen in their own backyard. So now who are they to tell anyone else how to live or how to do things? So they lost their moral authority there. And finally, you have nationalism. Now, nationalism was, as we know, was a driving European trend that had been a main cause of both World Wars I and World War II. And so in response, these colonized people also felt that they deserved their own sovereign nations where they could determine their own destiny without European interference in their affairs. And so those are your three main factors that best explain the independence of former colonies in Africa and Asia after World War II. What approach did Mohandas Gandhi follow to achieve political independence of India? All right, and by the way, keep in mind that Mahatma Gandhi and Mohandas Gandhi are the same person. Mahatma is simply his nickname. So Gandhi had a theory. And his theory went like this. One country cannot oppress another country without a certain amount of cooperation from the victims. They need their victims to cooperate on some level, or victimization simply will not be sustainable. So if the victims, and in this case, the victims are the people of India, if they employ nonviolent, non-cooperation in every possible circumstance, then the British would eventually find it impossible to continue ruling over them. And so this nonviolent cooperation took such forms as, for example, passive resistance, right? I'm not going to fight you, but I'm also not going to obey you either. And I'm not going to just go where you tell me to go and do what you tell me to do. I'm not going to fight you, but I'm going to resist obeying you. Not to mention, here's another way, boycotting British manufactured goods. You know, one of the reasons you're over here in my country is to use us as a market for the stuff that comes out of your factories. So, in the name of nonviolent non-cooperation, we are going to not buy your stuff. And instead, we're going to encourage and support our own homegrown cottage industries and buy from them instead of you. And that's why the support of cottage industry in India was a huge part of what Gandhi was doing. Last question. In what form of government do ordinary citizens participate most actively in the making of political decisions? And this question really kind of brings the whole thing to a big conclusion. Especially we can kind of tie together events of today with what we were just talking about with Lech Walesa and solidarity. So in Cold War terms, the answer to this question is a Western democracy. In a Western democracy, citizens can elect their own representatives, they can elect their own leaders, they can even form their own political parties if they want to. In the news just today, May 12th, 2021, Republican House Representative Liz Cheney was just voted out of her leadership positions in the House of Representatives, voted out by her fellow Republicans. They were punishing her for saying that Donald Trump lied about the election being stolen from him, and they were punishing her for saying that Trump was responsible for the January 6th Capitol insurrection. And in response to this, Liz Cheney announced just today that she might form her own political party to provide some competition against the Republicans. You can do that in a Western democracy. On the other hand, in the Soviet Union, that was a one-party dictatorship. The Communist Party was the only party allowed to operate, and anybody who tried to form another party would find themselves in a world of hurt. And that's why the transition of the Polish trade union Solidarity under the leadership of Lech Walesa into a second political party was so pivotal, because it was like a piece of political malware or like a political Trojan horse to the entire Soviet system, because that one development undermined the entire Eastern Bloc and eventually brought down communism itself throughout Europe, because communism is a one-party system. It absolutely must be one party. It cannot tolerate any competition like Solidarity gave it. So that is our review. I hope you put it to good use, and I hope it helps you become very successful on this Unit 11 test.